I've got a challenge for you. Try to picture some of the most powerful countries in the 20th century. What comes to mind? The British Empire, the United States, the USSR maybe? But here's the thing, there's one country that people rarely think of as a superpower. Today, I'm talking about Argentina. Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world and had amongst the highest literacy rates, and it was experiencing the fastest rate of growth recorded anywhere on the planet. Moreover, immigrants flocked to Argentina from all corners of the globe in search for a better life, to the point where half of Argentina's capital's population was foreign-born. But then something happened. Today, Argentina is on the news for all the wrong reasons. We need to talk about how Argentina measured up to the US. Picture this, it's the early 20th century. Both the US and Argentina were taking advantage of globalization and riding the wave to prosperity. Both countries are young, dynamic nations, and they're very similar in many ways. They both started off as colonies of a European power, they're both blessed with fertile farmlands, and they're growing rich from exports to Europe, and both were favorable destinations for European migrants looking to start a new life. On the face of it, even their culture developed similarly. Both were dominated by a white settler majority in search for a better life, and both embraced the frontier as the nations expanded westwards, which was symbolized by the Argentine gaucho and the American cowboy. But you see, there's a key difference between the two countries, one that would put the two nations on wildly different trajectories. America would continue its rapid economic expansion and go on to become a world power. Argentina would spiral into economic chaos and crisis from which it would never get out. So what exactly happened? You see, there's one important issue, and that was with how new land got distributed. In America, you had individuals and families given small parcels of land to grow their food on. The government in the US encouraged small family holdings. In Argentina, however, only a few rich landowners got their hands on most of the land. Now, when this happened, it eventually gave rise to a powerful aristocracy, a class that would soon continue to hinder Argentina's economic progress. Argentina's biggest moneymaker was agricultural exports. However, those who controlled the farmlands looked down on the actual practice of farming and agriculture, which doesn't really make sense. They liked the rich, refined lifestyles in cities, immersed in European arts and culture. They didn't care for farming. So the money that was generated from farming and agriculture in the country was rarely reinvested. Instead, these rich landowners spent it on imported luxury goods and bought more land with it. What's worse is that these very elites prevented Argentina from fully industrializing. They pushed for policies that would protect their set-up enterprises and prevent competition. You see, when you prevent competition, you get inefficiency, and this resulted in not being able to meet domestic demands. Ironically, while such policies were justified by these rich elites as making the country more self-sufficient, it made Argentina even more dependent on imports. And this strategy would quickly harm Argentina's progress. It would make them complacent. Beginning in 1929, the world entered the Great Depression. Demand for agricultural exports from Argentina, which they relied heavily on, started to fall. So you had a situation where exports were falling. Both its debts and import burden were also continuing to grow. Now, over in the US, people also were not super happy with the government. However, we can observe some real changes that was made to address the growing discontent. And this should have been the wake-up call for Argentinian politicians. But the elites dominated the political process and resisted making any changes. In Argentina, the elites, instead of trying to fix the problem, they simply blamed it on a foreign conspiracy. Now, this didn't really resonate with ordinary Argentinians. They continued to demand reforms. In fear of losing influence, these rich landowners decided to undermine the democratic process altogether, and they conducted electoral fraud just to stay in power. Argentina's spiral into decades of instability was now set in motion. The Argentinian government would alternate between factions that represented landowners and workers respectively. Both would promise to turn the ship around and revive the economy. However, in reality, both parties made the situation worse. Rather than address the root cause of the problem, the government instead turned to ineffective short-term strategies to win support. This included lavish promises of social welfare, which only increased their debt burden. Worse still, it encouraged rent-seeking. This meant that groups competed to gain more money from the state instead of making money from any productive economic activity. As the decades passed, Argentina's situation continued to grow worse. In the 1910s, your average Argentinian was actually richer than their American counterpart. But today, Argentinians are nearly 5.5 times poorer than those in the United States. Now, all of this, if you trace back to the very beginning, boils down to one thing. Who got all the land? It was the elites, and when the elites used their privilege and power to be complacent and unstrategic, things started to spiral real quick. Argentina's example is a clear reminder of how highly unequal land ownership can hinder a nation's long-term prosperity. In 3 centuries back, the economic philosopher Adam Smith made a note of how dangerous it was for rich landowners to try and influence the economic policy of any nation. There is a reason why during the height of feudalism, in places where only a few families controlled most of the land, economic growth was largely stagnant in those places. But when the idea of land being owned by only a few rich families was weakened, we started to see these economic nations begin to prosper. By the way, I made a whole video explaining the link between property ownership and prosperity. I'd recommend that you try to check that one out because it includes some really valuable information and background material that would help you understand this topic even better. You see, in the case of Argentina, this really was an important reminder of how prosperity is never guaranteed. A country can have everything going for it, but if it chooses to adopt bad policies, especially ones that favor some groups over others, then that nation is bound to fail. That's why I think the recent developments in the US are quite worrying. Land ownership has become unequal and concentrated in the hands of the few, because if this trend continues, we might see it translate to a real political crisis, and by extension, it could bring long-term harm to the US economy. They should see the example of Argentina and really learn about the consequences of this. If you carry this on for a very long period of time, eventually it's gonna hurt the long-term prosperity of the country. Now look, I know that the US and Argentina are not at the same place that they were back in the early 20th century. The world has become a much more complicated place with lots of factors impacting the prosperity of a country. You have technological developments, you have diplomatic relationships with other countries, and there are geopolitical issues that impact a country's prosperity far beyond we could ever imagine. But given the size and importance of the US economy, if they suffer the same fate as Argentina, then the ripple effects would be seen worldwide.